The scorching June sun beat down on the dusty streets of Provo, Utah Territory in 1878, and Victoria Grayson had already decided this would be the worst day of her life before the men outside the general store started their jeering. She had come to town to purchase supplies for the small boarding house she ran on the edge of town, the one her late mother had left her 6 months ago. The boarding house barely scraped by, and everyone in Provo knew it. Everyone also knew that Victoria, at 24 years old, was unmarried, peculiar, and far too educated for a woman in these parts. She read books, kept accounts, and had once told Mayor Henderson that his arithmetic regarding town taxes was fundamentally flawed. These things did not endear her to the good people of Provo, but she had never expected this level of cruelty. "Look at her, boys," called out Morton Banks, the blacksmith's son, a mean-spirited man of 30 who spent more time drinking than working. "Walking around like she owns the place, when everyone knows that boarding house is about to go under." Victoria kept her eyes forward, her basket clutched tightly in her hands. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She was not a vain woman, but she took pride in her appearance and her dignity. "I heard she can't even get boarders anymore," added another voice, this one belonging to Samuel Worth, who worked at the livery. "Who would want to stay in a place run by a woman who thinks she is smarter than every man in town?" Victoria's cheeks burned, but she continued walking. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. These men fed on reaction, on the power they felt when they could make someone smaller than themselves. "Maybe she should find herself a husband," Morton called out, and the group of 4 men laughed. "Oh wait, no man in his right mind would have her. Too many opinions, not enough sense to keep her mouth shut." The word stung more than Victoria wanted to admit. It was not that she desperately wanted marriage. She had always been content with her independence, but the mockery of her unmarried state, as if it were evidence of some fundamental unworthiness, cut deep into the tender places she tried to protect. She was nearly past them, nearly free, when Morton stepped into her path. "Where are you going so fast, Miss Grayson?" he asked, his breath reeking of whiskey even at this early hour. "We are just having a friendly conversation." Victoria's heart hammered in her chest. She was not a fearful woman by nature, but she was also not foolish. 4 drunk men in the middle of the street could do whatever they wanted, and the good people of Provo would likely turn a blind eye. She was not well liked enough for anyone to risk confrontation on her behalf. "Please let me pass," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Please let me pass," Morton mimicked in a high-pitched voice, and his friends erupted in laughter again. Victoria's hands shook slightly, and she hated herself for showing even that small sign of fear. She opened her mouth to speak again, though she had no idea what she would say, when a new voice cut through the air like a knife. "The lady asked you to let her pass." The voice was low, calm, and carried the kind of authority that made men listen whether they wanted to or not. Victoria looked up to see a man she had never seen before in Provo, and she was certain she would have remembered him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscled build of someone who spent his life working outdoors. He wore typical cowboy attire, dusty denim trousers, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen its share of sun and storms. His face was tanned and weathered, probably in his late 20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days' worth of beard growth. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking pale blue that seemed to see right through the nonsense to the truth beneath. Morton turned, sizing up the stranger. "This is none of your concern, friend." "I am not your friend," the man said simply. And it became my concern when you decided to block a lady's path and harass her in broad daylight." "Lady," Samuel Worth laughed. "That is Victoria Grayson. She is no lady, just a woman who does not know her place." The stranger's expression did not change, but something in his eyes grew colder. "Seems to me her place is wherever she chooses to walk, and right now she is choosing to walk away from you." He turned his attention to Victoria, and his expression softened considerably. "Miss, would you do me the honor of walking with me instead? I am new to town and could use someone to show me around." Victoria stared at him, momentarily struck speechless. No one in Provo had ever stood up for her like this. No one had ever offered her such simple kindness in the face of cruelty. She started, her voice catching slightly. "I would appreciate that, thank you." The stranger stepped forward, positioning himself between Victoria and Morton with an ease that suggested he had done this sort of thing before. He offered Victoria his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His arm was solid and steady beneath her hand, and she felt some of her shaking subside. "You are making a mistake, friend," Morton said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "You do not know how things work around here." The stranger paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Then I suppose I will just have to learn. But I will tell you this, where I come from, men who harass women are considered cowards and treated accordingly. I am guessing that is true here too, once the whiskey wears off, and you have to face what you have done in the clear light of day." Without waiting for a response, he guided Victoria away from the group, his pace unhurried but purposeful. Victoria could feel the stares of the townspeople who had witnessed the confrontation, could sense their judgment and curiosity. She kept her head high, refusing to show shame for something that was not her fault. They walked in silence for half a block before the stranger spoke again. "Are you all right, miss?" Victoria took a shaky breath. "I am fine. Thank you for your intervention. You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said simply. "I could not stand by and watch that. My mother raised me better than that." Something about the mention of his mother, said with such simple respect, made Victoria's eyes sting with unexpected tears. She blinked them back rapidly. "Well, your mother did an excellent job. I am Victoria Grayson." "Vincent Garrett," he replied. "Most people call me Vince. I just arrived in town this morning, actually. I am looking for work, preferably ranch work, but I will take whatever is available." Victoria glanced at him with new interest. "You are a cowboy, then?" "Yes, madam. Been working cattle since I was 14 years old. Worked my way up from Texas through Colorado, and now I am here in Utah Territory. Heard there might be opportunities in this area." "There are a few ranches around Provo," Victoria said, grateful for the distraction of normal conversation. "The largest is the Peterson Ranch, about 5 miles west of town. They are always looking for experienced hands, especially this time of year." "I appreciate the information," Vince said. They had reached a small park area near the edge of town, a few scraggly trees providing some shade from the relentless sun. "Would you like to sit for a moment? You still look a bit shaken." Victoria wanted to refuse, to insist she was perfectly fine, but the truth was her legs felt like they might give out. She nodded, and they sat on a weathered wooden bench beneath one of the trees. "I apologize for those men," Victoria said after a moment. "Provo is not usually quite so hostile, but I seem to bring out the worst in certain people." Vince looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes. "Something tells me the problem is not with you, Miss Grayson." Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "You are kind to say so, but the truth is I have never quite fit in here. My mother was a school teacher before she married, and she taught me to read and write and think for myself. She encouraged me to speak my mind and to never settle for less than I deserved." Those are not qualities that endear a woman to this community. Then this community has a problem, Vince said flatly. Those are qualities that should be admired in anyone, regardless of whether they are a man or a woman. Victoria found herself studying him more closely. He was undeniably handsome, but it was more than that. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with knowing who he was and being comfortable in that knowledge. "Where are you from originally, Mr. Garrett?" she asked. "Please call me Vince," he said. "I am from a small town in Texas near San Antonio. My father died when I was young, and my mother raised me and my two sisters on her own. She worked as a seamstress and took in laundry, and she taught us that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their station in life. I suppose that lesson stuck with me." "You have sisters," Victoria said, understanding dawning. "That explains why you understand that women are not delicate creatures who need to be coddled or controlled." Vince smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and more approachable. "My sisters would laugh at the idea of being delicate. Sarah can outrope most men I know, and Margaret can shoot better than anyone I have ever met. They are both married now, to good men who appreciate them for who they are." Victoria felt a pang of longing. "That sounds wonderful. I confess, sometimes I feel quite alone in my views." "My mother understood, but she passed 6 months ago, and since then." She trailed off, not wanting to burden this stranger with her problems. "Since then, it has been harder," Vince finished gently. "I lost my mother 2 years ago. I understand that particular kind of loneliness." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sparse foot traffic on the street. Victoria found herself relaxing in a way she had not in months. There was something about Vince's presence that felt safe, uncomplicated. "You mentioned you run a boarding house," Vince said eventually. "I am going to need a place to stay while I look for work. Would you have a room available?" Victoria's first instinct was to say yes immediately. She desperately needed the income, and Vince seemed like he would be a respectful, easy boarder. But doubt crept in quickly. "I should warn you, staying at my boarding house might not endear you to the people of Provo. As you witnessed, I am not exactly popular." Vince's expression turned stubborn. "I do not choose my accommodations based on popularity contests, Miss Grayson. I choose them based on cleanliness, fair prices, and the character of the proprietor. Something tells me your establishment meets all those criteria." Despite everything, Victoria felt herself smile. "It does, though I may be biased. I charge 50 cents a night, which includes breakfast and dinner. The rooms are small but clean, and I do laundry once a week for an additional fee." "That sounds perfect," Vince said. "Would you mind showing me the place now?" "I have my horse and belongings tied up at the general store." "Of course," Victoria said, standing up. She felt significantly steadier now, both physically and emotionally. "Let us collect your things, and I will show you the way." As they walked back toward the main street, Victoria was acutely aware of the stares they attracted. Provo was a small town, and gossip spread faster than wildfire. By nightfall, everyone would know that Victoria Grayson had been seen walking arm in arm with a strange cowboy, sitting with him in the park, and taking him back to her boarding house. The scandal would be delicious for those who enjoyed such things. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria found that she did not care. They retrieved Vince's horse, a beautiful chestnut mare named Copper, and his saddlebags, which contained all his worldly possessions. The walk to the boarding house took about 15 minutes, and Victoria found herself talking more freely than she had in months. There was something about Vince that invited confidence, a quality of deep listening that made her feel truly heard. The boarding house was a two-story wooden structure that had seen better days. The paint was peeling in places, and the porch sagged slightly on one side, but it was clean and well-maintained given Victoria's limited resources. She led Vince around to the small stable behind the house, where he could settle Copper alongside the two horses belonging to her other boarders. "I currently have two other guests," Victoria explained as they entered through the back door. "Mr. Patterson, who works for the railroad and is here temporarily while they survey new routes, and Mr. Chen, who is a laborer helping with the construction of the new church. Both are quiet, respectful men who keep to themselves." The inside of the boarding house was simple but comfortable. The kitchen was spacious, with a large wood burning stove and a sturdy table that could seat 8. The parlor had a few worn but comfortable chairs and a shelf of books that had belonged to Victoria's mother. Upstairs, there were 5 small bedrooms. "This is lovely," Vince said, and he sounded sincere. "You keep a fine house, Miss Grayson." Victoria felt a flush of pride. "Thank you. My mother taught me well. Your room will be at the end of the hall, the one with the window facing east. You will get good morning light." She showed him upstairs, acutely aware of the impropriety of being alone with a man in the sleeping quarters, even if it was her own house. But Vince maintained a respectful distance, and his manner was so straightforward and honest that she felt no discomfort. The room was small, containing a single bed, a washstand, a small table with a chair and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. But it was clean, the sheets were fresh, and there was a quilt that Victoria's mother had sewn herself. "This is perfect," Vince said, setting down his saddlebags. "I appreciate your hospitality, Miss Grayson. Please call me Victoria," she said. "After this morning, I think we can dispense with extreme formality." Vince smiled that transformative smile again. "Victoria it is, then." Over the next few days, Victoria found herself looking forward to mealtimes with an anticipation that had nothing to do with food. Vince had a natural way of drawing people out, and soon he had both Mr. Patterson and Mr. Chen chatting more freely than they ever had before. The boarding house, which had felt so empty and sad since her mother's death, began to feel almost like a home again. Vince found work at the Peterson Ranch, just as Victoria had suggested. The ranch foreman, a gruff man named Bill Harlow, recognized quality when he saw it, and Vince's skills with horses and cattle quickly made him invaluable. He worked long days, often leaving before dawn and not returning until after sunset, but he never missed dinner at the boarding house, and he always took the time to help Victoria with evening chores before retiring to his room. "You do not have to do that," Victoria protested one evening as Vince insisted on helping her wash the dinner dishes. "You have been working all day." "So have you," Vince pointed out, rolling up his sleeves. "Besides, I like helping. It reminds me of home, doing dishes with my sisters while we talked about our days." Victoria found herself smiling as she handed him a wet plate to dry. "What were your sisters like growing up?" Vince's expression grew fond. "Loud, stubborn, and fiercely loyal. Sarah is 2 years younger than me. She is 26 now, and Margaret is 23. Sarah married a rancher and has 2 little ones already, a boy and a girl. Margaret married a sheriff, which we all found hilarious because she was the wildest of the 3 of us growing up." "You miss them," Victoria observed. "Every day," Vince admitted. "But a man has to make his own way in the world, and there was not enough work back home for all of us. I send money when I can, and I write letters. It is not the same as being there, but it is what I can do right now." Victoria understood that feeling all too well. "I have always been alone in a sense. I was my mother's only child. My father died of cholera when I was 5 years old, too young to really remember him. It was just my mother and me for most of my life." That must have been difficult, Vince said quietly. In some ways, Victoria acknowledged. But it also made us very close. She was my best friend, my teacher, my everything. Losing her has been. She paused, surprised to find tears threatening again. She had thought herself cried out weeks ago. Vince set down the dish he was drying and turned to face her fully. It has been devastating, he finished for her. I know. When my mother died, I felt like the ground had disappeared from beneath my feet. Everything I had built my life on was suddenly gone. Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. Vince, with infinite gentleness, placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it contained so much compassion that Victoria felt something inside her crack open. Before she could stop herself, she was crying, really crying, in a way she had not allowed herself to since the funeral. Vince pulled her into his arms, holding her with the careful tenderness of someone who understood grief intimately. He did not tell her not to cry, did not offer platitudes about time healing all wounds or her mother being in a better place. He just held her and let her mourn. When Victoria finally pulled back, embarrassed and wiping at her eyes with her apron, Vince simply handed her a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "Better?" he asked gently. "Yes," Victoria said, and she meant it. "Thank you. I apologize for falling apart on you like that." "Do not apologize for being human," Vince said. "Grief is not something you can schedule or control. It comes when it comes, and all you can do is let it pass through you." Victoria looked at this man who had appeared in her life so unexpectedly, and she felt something shift in her chest. It was too soon to call it love. She barely knew him, but it was definitely the beginning of something significant. As the weeks passed, that feeling only grew stronger. Vince became a fixture in Victoria's daily life, and she found herself structuring her days around the moments she would see him. She woke early to prepare a good breakfast, taking extra care with the biscuits because she had noticed they were his favorite. She found herself choosing her dresses more carefully, telling herself it was just about taking pride in her appearance, but knowing deep down that she wanted to look nice for him. Vince, for his part, seemed to find excuses to spend time with her. He helped with repairs around the boarding house, fixing the sagging porch and replacing some rotted boards in the stable. He accompanied her on her weekly trip into town for supplies, and his presence kept men like Morton Banks from bothering her. He brought her wildflowers he had found on the range, simple bouquets of Indian paintbrush and lupine that brightened her kitchen table. They talked for hours, sitting on the porch in the cooling evenings, about everything and nothing. Vince told her stories about his travels, about the different towns and territories he had seen, the people he had met. Victoria shared her dreams of maybe someday expanding the boarding house, of creating a place that was truly welcoming, where people could come and feel at home. "You could do it," Vince said one evening. "You have a gift for making people feel comfortable, Victoria. Look at how this place has changed since I arrived. Mr. Patterson and Mr. Chen actually smile now. They linger after meals to chat. That is all because of you and the environment you have created." Victoria felt her cheeks warm with pleasure at the compliment. "You have helped with that too. You have a way of bringing people together." "Maybe we make a good team," Vince said, and there was something in his voice, a deeper meaning beneath the casual words. Victoria's heart beat faster. "Maybe we do." That night, lying in her bed, Victoria allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with Vincent Garrett. It terrified her. Love made you vulnerable, and Victoria had built her life on self-sufficiency and independence. But it also thrilled her because Vince was unlike any man she had ever known. He respected her mind, appreciated her strength, and treated her as an equal. With him, She did not have to pretend to be less than she was. She could just be herself. The question was whether Vince felt the same way. He was kind and attentive, but he was also that way with everyone. Perhaps she was reading too much into simple friendship and gratitude for decent lodging. Victoria's questions were answered 2 days later in the most unexpected way. She had gone into town alone, as Vince had to work late at the ranch. She completed her errands quickly, hoping to avoid any unpleasant encounters, and was heading back to where she had tied her small cart when she heard raised voices. "She has him fooled, just like she fools everyone," Morton Banks was saying. He was even drunker than usual, his face red and his words slurred. "That Garrett fellow thinks he is defending some innocent lady, but Victoria Grayson is nothing but a scheming woman trying to trap a man into marriage." Victoria froze, her hand clutching her basket so tightly her knuckles went white. She should leave, should not subject herself to this, but her feet would not move. "She has probably been throwing herself at him since he arrived," Samuel Worth added. "Using her boarding house to get him alone, working her wiles on him. Mark my words, she will announce their engagement any day now, and that poor fool will not realize until it is too late that he has shackled himself to a bitter spinster." The words were so cruel, so viciously unfair that Victoria felt like she had been physically struck. She had done nothing wrong, nothing inappropriate. She had simply provided lodging and friendship to a decent man. But in the eyes of these men, even that was evidence of manipulation and scheming. "That is enough." Vince's voice cut through the air like a whip crack, and Victoria's eyes flew open in shock. She had not heard him approach, but there he was, standing between her and the 2 drunk men with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Garrett," Morton said, trying to sound jovial and failing miserably, "we were just discussing your landlady." "I heard what you were discussing," Vince said, his voice deadly calm. "And I am going to give you one chance to apologize to Miss Grayson before I make you regret every word that came out of your mouth." "Apologize?" Samuel laughed. "For speaking the truth?" Vince moved so fast that Victoria barely saw it. One moment he was standing still, the next he had grabbed Samuel by the shirt front and lifted him almost off his feet. "Let me make something very clear," Vince said, his face inches from Samuel's. "Victoria Grayson is one of the finest, most honorable people I have ever met. She runs an honest business, treats people with respect, and asks nothing from anyone. If you or anyone else in this town has a problem with her, it says everything about your character and nothing about hers. Do you understand me?" Samuel, suddenly sober with fear, nodded frantically. Vince released him with a slight shove that sent the man stumbling backward. "And you," Vince said, turning to Morton, "you have been harassing Victoria for months, maybe longer. It stops now. If I hear that you or anyone else has said one more unkind word to her or about her, I will make it my personal mission to ensure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are. Are we clear?" Morton, faced with someone who was not intimidated by his bluster, deflated like a punctured bladder. "Clear," he muttered. "Good," Vince said. He turned to Victoria and his expression softened immediately. "Are you all right?" Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. Vince took her basket and her arm, guiding her away from the 2 men and toward her cart. "I am sorry you had to hear that," he said once they were out of earshot. "Those men are cowards and fools. You should not have confronted them," Victoria said, finding her voice finally. "Now they will make your life difficult too." Vince helped her into the cart with careful courtesy before walking around to unhitch her horse. "I do not care what they think of me, Victoria. I care about you. I cannot stand by and let people treat you that way." Something in his voice made Victoria's breath catch. She watched as he mounted Copper, who he had ridden into town directly from the ranch, and maneuvered the horse to walk alongside her cart as they headed out of town. They rode in silence for a few minutes before Vince spoke again. "Those men said something that, while they meant it as an insult, actually gave me an idea." Victoria glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Vince took a deep breath, and Victoria realized with shock that he looked nervous. "They suggested that I might want to marry you." They meant it as mockery, as if that would be some terrible fate. "But the truth is, Victoria, I cannot think of anything I would want more." Victoria's cart lurched as she accidentally pulled on the reins. Her horse whinnied in protest, and she quickly corrected, but her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "What are you saying?" she managed to ask. Vince guided Copper closer, so he was riding right beside her. "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you, Victoria Grayson. I did not come to Provo looking for love. I was just passing through, looking for work. But then I saw you being harassed by those men, and something in me knew I could not just walk away. And every day since then, I have found another reason to love you. Your strength, your kindness, your intelligence, the way you care for people, the way you honor your mother's memory by living according to the values she taught you." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were not tears of sadness. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was too soon, that I barely know you, but I cannot help it. You have made me feel things I never thought I would feel, made me hope for things I had given up on." Vince pulled Copper to a stop, and Victoria halted her cart as well. He dismounted quickly and came to her side, helping her down from the cart. Once her feet were on the ground, he took both her hands in his. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know we have only known each other for a few weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to marry you, Victoria. I want to build a life with you, here in Provo or anywhere else you want to go. I want to help you make that boarding house into something wonderful, or I want to support whatever other dreams you have. I just want to be with you." Victoria looked up into those blue eyes that had been the first thing she noticed about him, and she saw nothing but sincerity and love. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Vince let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her into his arms. He kissed her, gentle at first and then with growing passion, and Victoria felt like her entire world had been turned right side up after being inverted for so long. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and smiling, Vince kept his arms around her. "I do not have a ring yet," he said. "But I will get you one, the best one I can afford." "I do not need a ring," Victoria said. "I just need you." But Vince insisted, and 3 days later he presented her with a simple gold band with a small sapphire. "The sapphire reminded me of your eyes," he explained, and Victoria cried again because no one had ever noticed the exact shade of blue-gray that her eyes were, let alone compared them to something precious. They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the boarding house. The local preacher, Reverend Thompson, who had always been kind to Victoria, performed the service. Mr. Patterson and Mr. Chen served as witnesses, along with Bill Harlow from the Peterson Ranch, who had become a good friend to Vince. Mrs. Allen, who ran the general store and who had always treated Victoria fairly, came as well, bringing a beautiful cake she had baked herself. It was not a large or fancy wedding, but it was filled with genuine love and happiness. Victoria wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, and Vince wore his best clothes, his hair neatly combed and his beard freshly trimmed. When he said his vows, promising to love and honor her for the rest of his life, his voice was strong and sure, and Victoria felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The greatest surprise came from an unexpected source. As the small gathering sat down to the wedding meal that Victoria had prepared with Mrs. Allen's help, there was a knock at the door. Victoria opened it to find Thomas Peterson himself, the owner of the Peterson Ranch, standing on her porch with his wife Alina. "We heard there was a wedding today," Thomas said with a gruff kindness. "We thought we would stop by and offer our congratulations." Victoria was stunned. Thomas Peterson was one of the most influential men in Provo, and she had never spoken more than a few words to him. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Please come in." The Petersons joined the celebration, and Thomas pulled Vince aside for a private conversation. When they returned, Vince was beaming. "Thomas has offered us the old foreman's house," he told Victoria, his excitement palpable. The previous foreman retired and moved to California to be near his daughter. "The house has been sitting empty, and Thomas says we can live there rent-free as long as I continue working for the ranch. It is bigger than the boarding house, Victoria, with enough land for a garden and some chickens." Victoria looked at Thomas in amazement. "Mr. Peterson, that is incredibly generous." Thomas shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Vince is the best hand I have had in years. I want to keep him happy, and that means making sure he and his new wife have a proper home. Besides, your boarding house should be a business, not your residence. You will make more money if you can rent out your current bedroom as well." It was a practical argument, but Victoria saw the kindness beneath it. The Petersons, unlike many in Provo, were not going to punish her for being different. They were going to judge her and Vince based on their character and their work. The celebration continued late into the evening, filled with laughter and good food, and the kind of joy that comes from authentic human connection. When everyone finally left, and it was just Victoria and Vince alone in the boarding house for the first time as husband and wife, they stood together on the porch, looking out at the star-filled Utah sky. "Are you happy?" Vince asked, his arm around Victoria's waist. "Happier than I have ever been," Victoria answered honestly. "I thought my life was meant to be small and difficult and lonely. You have given me so much more than I ever dreamed possible." "You have given me the same," Vince said. "A home, a purpose, and a love I never thought I would find." "We are going to build something wonderful together, Victoria. I promise you that." And he kept that promise. They moved into the foreman's house a week later. It was indeed larger than the boarding house, with 2 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a parlor with a fireplace. The house needed work. There were repairs to be made and painting to be done. But Victoria and Vince tackled each project together, often working late into the evening to make the place their own. Victoria continued to run the boarding house, now able to rent out all 5 rooms. With the additional income, and without the burden of paying rent on a separate residence, her financial situation improved dramatically. She hired a local woman, Mrs. Sarah Flores, whose husband had died the previous winter, to help with the cooking and cleaning. This gave Victoria more time to focus on the business side of things, and she began to advertise the boarding house in nearby towns. Within 6 months, the boarding house had a waiting list for rooms, known throughout the territory for its cleanliness, good food, and welcoming atmosphere. Victoria's reputation began to change in Provo as well. It was hard to dismiss someone as a bitter spinster when she was happily married and running a successful business. Gradually, more people began to treat her with respect, if not warmth. Vince thrived in his work at the Peterson Ranch. His skills with horses were exceptional, and Thomas Peterson increasingly relied on him to train the ranch's horses and manage the other cowboys. Within a year, Thomas promoted Vince to foreman, a position that came with increased responsibility and better pay. But the best change was in Victoria herself. With Vince's love and support, she blossomed in ways she had never thought possible. The hard shell she had built around herself for protection gradually cracked open, revealing the warm, generous person beneath. She laughed more freely, spoke her mind without fear, and generally embraced life in a way she had not been able to when she was alone and defensive. Their first real test as a couple came in the spring of 1879, almost a year after their marriage. Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified. Her mother had told her stories about childbirth, about women who died bringing children into the world. Victoria had always been healthy and strong, but she knew that meant nothing when it came to the dangers of labor and delivery. Vince, when she told him, was overjoyed but also immediately attuned to her fear. "We will get through this together," he promised. "I will be with you every step of the way, and we will make sure you have the best care possible." He was true to his word. He accompanied her to every appointment with the midwife, Mrs. Ortega, an experienced woman who had delivered dozens of babies in Provo and the surrounding areas. He rubbed Victoria's feet when they swelled, made her tea when she felt nauseous, and held her when the fear became overwhelming. "What if something goes wrong?" Victoria asked one night, lying in bed with Vince's hand resting gently on her growing belly. "Then we will face it together," Vince said simply. "But Victoria, you are strong. You have overcome so much in your life. You can do this too, and I will be right there with you." His faith in her helped Victoria find faith in herself. She prepared practically, following Mrs. Ortega's advice about diet and exercise, but she also prepared emotionally, talking through her fears with Vince and gradually accepting that some things were beyond her control. Their son was born on a cold December morning in 1879. After a long and difficult labor. Vince stayed with Victoria throughout, ignoring the midwife's initial protests that men did not belong in the birthing room. He held Victoria's hand, wiped her forehead, and whispered encouragement even when she screamed that she could not do this, that it was too much. And then, suddenly, there was a baby crying, and Mrs. Ortega was placing a tiny, perfect infant in Victoria's arms, and Vince was crying as he looked at his son for the first time. "He is beautiful," Vince whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it, Victoria. You were so brave." They named him William, after Vince's father, and called him Will. He was a healthy baby with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes, and from the moment he entered the world, he was loved beyond measure. Parenthood changed them both in profound ways. Vince, already a caring man, became even more patient and gentle. Victoria, who had always been independent and self-reliant, learned to accept help and to work as part of a team. They took turns walking the floor with Will when he cried at night, worked together to figure out the mysteries of baby care, and marveled constantly at the miracle they had created. The boarding house continued to thrive with Mrs. Flores taking on even more responsibility so that Victoria could spend time with her son. Vince's position as foreman was secure, and the family's financial situation was comfortable, if not wealthy. But more than the material success, Victoria and Vince had built something rarer and more valuable. A genuine partnership based on mutual respect, trust, and deep love. They made decisions together, supported each other's dreams, and faced challenges as a team. When Will was 6 months old, they received a letter from Texas. Vince's sister Sarah wrote that their sister Margaret was getting ready to have her first baby, and could Vince possibly come for a visit. He had not seen his sisters in over 3 years, and Sarah worried that if he did not come soon, Will would be too old to travel comfortably. "You should go," Victoria said immediately when Vince showed her the letter. Your sisters need to meet their nephew and you need to see them. Come with me, Vince said. I want you to meet them, Victoria. I want them to know the incredible woman I married. Victoria hesitated. The trip would be long and arduous with a baby, and she worried about leaving the boarding house for the extended time the journey would require. But the hope in Vince's eyes made the decision for her. All right, she agreed. Let us go to Texas. The journey was indeed difficult, involving trains and stagecoaches and more than a few nights camping under the stars. But Will was a good traveler, and Victoria found herself enjoying the adventure despite the discomforts. She had never left Utah Territory before, and seeing new places and landscapes was thrilling. When they finally arrived at Sarah's ranch outside San Antonio, Victoria was nervous. What if Vince's sisters did not like her? What if they thought she was not good enough for their brother? Her fears were groundless. Sarah and Margaret, both warm and welcoming women who clearly adored their older brother, embraced Victoria like she was already family. They cooed over Will, exclaimed over his blue eyes, and immediately pulled Victoria into the easy rhythm of their lives. I am so glad Vince found you, Sarah said one afternoon while they were preparing dinner together. He was always so restless, searching for something he could not name. But in his letters he sounds settled and happy. That is because of you. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. He saved me, she said quietly. I was so alone and then he appeared and everything changed. He gave me hope again. You saved each other, Margaret said wisely. That is what the best marriages are about. Two people making each other better than they could be alone. The visit lasted 3 weeks, and by the end, Victoria felt like she had gained 2 sisters of her own. The goodbye was tearful, with promises to write often and visit again soon. On the journey back to Utah, Victoria sat in the stagecoach with Will sleeping in her arms and Vince dozing beside her, and she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. 2 years ago, she had been alone, mocked, struggling to survive. Now she was part of a family, respected, financially secure, and deeply loved. Life continued to unfold in beautiful and unexpected ways. When Will was 2 years old, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the fear was less acute, tempered by the knowledge that she had done this before and survived. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1882, an easier birth than Will's had been. They named her Maribeth, after both their mothers, and called her Mary. Mary was different from Will from the beginning. Where he had been calm and observant, she was energetic and vocal. She kept them on their toes and filled their home with noise and laughter. The boarding house became an institution in Provo, known throughout Utah Territory. Victoria had to turn away more potential boarders than she could accept, and she began to seriously consider Thomas Peterson's suggestion that she expand, perhaps buying another property to run as a second location. But what gave Victoria the most pride was not the business success. It was the way the boarding house had become a genuine community. Boarders stayed for months or even years, becoming like extended family. Victoria hosted holiday dinners where everyone was welcome, regardless of whether they had family in the area. The dining table that had once sat silent and empty now rang with conversation and laughter every evening. The people of Provo gradually came to see Victoria not as the odd, too educated woman who did not know her place, but as a successful businesswoman and devoted mother. The men who had once mocked her in the street now tipped their hats respectfully when they passed. Morton Banks, who never did manage to hold down steady work, left town a few years after Victoria's marriage, and no one missed him. When Will was 5 and Mary was 3, Victoria and Vince decided to officially expand. They purchased a second property in Provo, a larger building that could house up to 10 boarders. Victoria trained a young woman named Emma Chen, the daughter of their former boarder Mr. Chen, to manage the new location. Emma was smart and capable, and under Victoria's mentorship, she flourished. Vince continued to excel at the Peterson Ranch. Thomas Peterson, now getting older and without children of his own to inherit the ranch, began to rely on Vince more and more to make major decisions about the operation. There were quiet conversations about Vince eventually becoming a partner in the ranch, though nothing was formalized. As the years passed, Victoria and Vince's love only deepened. They had weathered challenges together, the sleepless nights of early parenthood, the financial stress of business expansion, the occasional disagreements that any couple faces, but through it all, they remained committed to each other and to the partnership they had built. One evening in the summer of 1885, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching Will and Mary play in the yard. Will, now 6, was teaching his little sister how to skip rocks in the small pond near their house. "You ever think about that day we met?" Victoria asked, leaning against Vince's shoulder. "All the time," Vince admitted. "I think about how easily it could have gone differently. I could have ridden past without stopping. I could have decided that what those men were doing was not my business." "But you did not," Victoria said. "You saw someone who needed help and you helped. That is who you are, Vince. That is one of the million reasons I love you." Vince kissed the top of her head. "I saw someone worth defending, someone special." "I did not know then how special, how amazing, but I knew enough to know I could not just walk away." "Walk with me instead," Victoria said softly, remembering his words from that first day. "Always," Vince promised. "For the rest of my life I will walk with you." In the years that followed, that promise was tested in various ways. In 1887, Victoria's boarding houses faced competition when a large hotel opened in Provo. But Victoria's establishments had something the hotel could not replicate: a genuine sense of home and community. Her boarders were not just customers, they were guests, treated like family. The hotels could offer fancier accommodations, but they could not offer what Victoria provided, and her business continued to thrive. In 1889, Vince broke his leg badly when a horse spooked and threw him. The injury was serious enough that he could not work for 3 months. It was a difficult time financially and emotionally, as Vince struggled with the forced inactivity and the fear that he might never work as a cowboy again. But Victoria supported him through it, both emotionally and financially, and her business sustained them until Vince healed and could return to work. These challenges brought them closer rather than driving them apart, because they faced them as a team, with open communication and mutual support. Will grew into a thoughtful, intelligent boy who loved books like his mother and horses like his father. Mary was bold and adventurous, constantly getting into minor scrapes and adventures. In 1888, Victoria gave birth to their third child, another son they named Samuel Thomas, called Sam. He was a happy, easygoing baby who grew into a cheerful toddler. As the 1890s began, Victoria and Vince's life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The boarding houses were successful and well established. Vince had indeed become a full partner in the Peterson Ranch when Thomas officially retired in 1891, selling Vince a significant share of the operation at a very fair price. Their children were healthy and thriving. But the greatest achievement in Victoria's mind was the relationship she and Vince had built. After more than a decade of marriage, they were still each other's best friend, closest confidant, and passionate lover. They still talked for hours on their porch in the evenings. They still laughed together, made plans together, dreamed together. One evening in the fall of 1893, after the children were in bed, Victoria and Vince sat together in their parlor. Vince was looking over some ranch accounts, and Victoria was working on a needlepoint project, a skill she had taken up in recent years. "I have been thinking," Victoria said, setting down her needlework, "about how our lives have turned out." Vince looked up from his papers. "And what conclusion have you reached?" "That I am grateful," Victoria said simply, "for all of it, even the hard parts, because they brought me here to this life with you." Vince set aside his work and moved to sit beside her on the sofa. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar patterns of her palm. "I feel the same way. Every choice I made, every road I traveled, led me to that street in Provo where I saw you being harassed. I would not change a single thing because it brought me to you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Vince spoke again. "Do you remember what those men said that day? That you were trying to trap a man into marriage?" Victoria laughed. "I remember. They were so certain they had me figured out. If they could see us now," Vince mused. 15 years later, still happy, still in love, still choosing each other every single day. I wonder what they would think. "I do not care what they would think," Victoria said, and she meant it. The girl who had cared so much about others' opinions, who had been wounded by their mockery, had grown into a woman secure in herself and her choices. "I only care what you think. I think I am the luckiest man alive," Vince said, pulling her close. "I think I saw a woman being mocked in the street, offered her my arm, and somehow convinced her to spend her life with me. And I will spend the rest of my days being grateful for that miracle." Victoria kissed him then, a kiss that held 15 years of love, commitment, trust, and passion. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. As the years continued to pass, Victoria and Vince's love story became something of a legend in Provo. People talked about the cowboy who had defended a woman being mocked and ended up marrying her, building a life that was the envy of many. Young couples would sometimes ask them for advice, wanting to know the secret to their obvious happiness. "There is no secret," Vince would always say. "You just have to find someone you respect as much as you love, and then you have to choose them every day, even on the days when it is hard. And you have to be honest," Victoria would add, "about your feelings, your fears, your dreams. You cannot build a life with someone if you are hiding parts of yourself." Will grew into a fine young man who decided he wanted to be a teacher, inspired by his grandmother's legacy. Victoria and Vince supported his choice, even though it meant he would not take over the family businesses. They had learned that loving your children meant letting them find their own path. Mary, true to her adventurous nature, became one of the first women in Utah to attend college, studying to become a nurse. Her parents were incredibly proud, even though it meant she moved to Salt Lake City for her education. Sam, the youngest, fell in love with ranching just like his father. By the time he was 15, he was working alongside Vince at the Peterson Ranch, learning everything he could about horses and cattle and land management. In 1898, 20 years after that fateful day in the street, Victoria and Vince decided to celebrate their anniversary in a special way. They arranged for the children to stay with friends and took a trip, just the two of them, back to Texas to visit Vince's sisters. Sarah and Margaret, both now mothers of teenagers themselves, welcomed them with open arms. The four of them spent long evenings talking and laughing, sharing stories about their lives and their children. "You two are exactly the same as you were 20 years ago," Margaret observed one evening. "Still looking at each other like you are the only two people in the world." "That is because in many ways we are," Vince said, reaching for Victoria's hand. "Everything else is just background noise. Victoria is my world." Victoria felt her eyes fill with happy tears. And you are mine. On the journey home, they talked about the future. Will would be graduating soon and starting his teaching career. Mary was thriving in her studies. Sam was becoming an invaluable help at the ranch. The businesses were stable and profitable. "We have built something good," Victoria said as their train rattled through the changing landscape. "Not just financially, but in our family and our community. We have made a difference." "You have made a difference," Vince corrected gently. "I helped, but Victoria, you are the heart of everything we have created. Your kindness, your strength, your vision, that is what has made our life what it is." Victoria shook her head. "We did it together. That is the point, Vince. Neither of us could have built this alone. We needed each other." As they approached Provo, the familiar landscape coming into view, Victoria felt a deep sense of peace. This was home, not just the physical place but the life they had created here. The businesses, the ranch, their children, their community, all of it was woven together into something beautiful and lasting. The years continued to unfold with their mix of joy and challenge. In 1901, Will married a lovely young woman named Catherine, a fellow teacher. The wedding was held at the boarding house, just as Victoria and Vince's had been, bringing things full circle. It was a much larger affair than their simple ceremony, with guests from all over Utah Territory, but the joy was the same. Mary graduated from nursing school and took a position at the hospital in Salt Lake City. She wrote home regularly, telling her parents about her work and the lives she was helping save. Victoria was incredibly proud of her daughter's independence and skill. Sam, at 18, was already being talked about as one of the most promising young ranchers in Utah. He had his father's natural ability with horses and his mother's head for business. The Peterson Ranch continued to thrive under the Garrett family's management. In 1903, Victoria and Vince became grandparents for the first time when Will and Catherine welcomed a daughter. They named her Victoria Eleanor, after both grandmothers, and called her Vicky. Holding her tiny granddaughter for the first time, Victoria was overwhelmed with emotion. This was the future they had built. This tiny girl who would grow up in a world shaped by the choices she and Vince had made. As they entered their 50s, Victoria and Vince began to slow down slightly, though neither would ever fully retire. Victoria promoted Emma to be the full manager of both boarding houses, retaining only an advisory role. Vince hired an assistant foreman at the ranch, a capable young man who could handle the more physically demanding work. This gave them more time to simply enjoy life together. They took walks in the evening, just as they had when they were courting. They read books together, discussing the stories and ideas. They traveled occasionally, taking trips to see their children and explore new places. On a spring evening in 1905, they celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home. The children were all pursuing their own lives now, Will with his growing family, Mary with her nursing career, Sam with his work at the ranch. The house was quiet in a way it had not been for many years. "You miss it?" Vince asked as they sat together on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the Utah mountains. When the children were young and the house was always full of noise and activity. Victoria considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I miss their laughter, their constant questions, the way they needed us, but I also love this phase of our life. We raised good people, Vince. We can be proud of that. And now we get to enjoy each other again without the constant demands of parenthood." "I like that too," Vince agreed. "Though I will admit being a grandfather is pretty wonderful. Vicky is absolutely brilliant," Victoria laughed. "You are biased, but yes, she is pretty special." They sat in comfortable silence, Vince's arm around Victoria's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. After more than a quarter century together, they had moved beyond the need for constant conversation. They could simply be together, finding comfort in each other's presence. "I love you," Victoria said quietly. "I know I tell you that every day, but I want you to know how much I mean it. You are still the best thing that ever happened to me, Vince. You gave me a life I never thought I could have." Vince kissed the top of her head. "You gave me the same gift. Before I met you, I was just drifting from place to place, never quite finding what I was looking for. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything that matters." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Victoria thought back to that day in 1878 when she had been standing in the street, humiliated and alone, and a stranger had offered his arm and changed everything. It seemed like a lifetime ago, and in many ways it was. She was a completely different person now than the frightened young woman she had been. But one thing had remained constant: Vince's love and the partnership they had built together. The years rolled on, bringing the changes and challenges that time always brings. In 1908, Sam married a local girl named Alice, and they began building their own life on a portion of the ranch land. Mary surprised everyone by falling in love with a doctor she worked with at the hospital, and they married in a beautiful ceremony in Salt Lake City in 1909. Will and Catherine had 3 more children, giving Victoria and Vince 4 grandchildren to dote on. The boarding houses continued to operate successfully, now regarded as historic institutions in Provo. The ranch prospered under Sam's increasingly prominent role in its management. Victoria and Vince's initial gamble, their decision to trust each other and build a life together, had paid off in ways neither could have imagined. In 1913, as they approached their 35th wedding anniversary, Victoria began planning a celebration. She wanted to mark the occasion with all their children and grandchildren together, a gathering that would celebrate not just their marriage but the family and community they had built. The party was held on a beautiful June day, eerily similar to that first day they had met all those years ago. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm but not too hot. Nearly 50 people gathered at the ranch house, including their children and grandchildren, Vince's sisters who had traveled from Texas, friends from town, current and former boarders, ranch hands and business associates. Standing together as the celebration swirled around them, Victoria and Vince took a moment to simply observe what they had created. Their children, all grown and successful, pursuing their own dreams. Their grandchildren, bright-eyed and full of potential. The friends and community members who had become like extended family. "Walk with me," Vince asked, offering Victoria his arm with a smile that echoed that first invitation so many years ago. "Always," Victoria said, taking his arm just as she had that first day. They walked through the gathering, greeting guests, accepting congratulations but mostly just enjoying the moment. Eventually, they made their way to a quiet spot under a large cottonwood tree, away from the noise and activity. 35 years, Victoria marveled. How did we get so lucky? It was not all luck, Vince pointed out. We worked for this. Every day we chose each other. Every challenge we faced together. That is not luck, that is commitment. You are right, Victoria agreed. But I still feel lucky. Lucky that you were in Provo that day. Lucky that you chose to intervene. Lucky that you saw something in me worth defending and worth loving. Vince cupped her face gently in his hands, looking at her with the same intensity he had 35 years ago. I did not make you worthy of love, Victoria. You already were. I just recognized it and felt grateful that you chose to share your life with me. They kissed then, a sweet, lingering kiss that held decades of love and commitment. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. Should we get back to the party? Victoria asked. In a minute, Vince said. "I just want to stand here with you for a moment longer. Just the two of us, the way it started." So they stood together under the cottonwood tree, arms around each other, watching the celebration of the life they had built. The sun was warm on their faces, and the sounds of laughter and music drifted on the breeze. Victoria thought about the girl she had been, alone and mocked in the street, sure that her life would always be difficult and lonely. She thought about the woman she had become, surrounded by family and friends, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and valued. And she thought about the man who had made that transformation possible, not by changing her or fixing her, but simply by seeing her, truly seeing her, and choosing to walk beside her. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Vince replied. "Yesterday, today, and every tomorrow we are given." As the afternoon faded into evening and the celebration continued around them, Victoria and Vince rejoined their family. They danced together, the same way they had at their wedding, moving in perfect synchronization after so many years together. They told stories about their early days together, making their children laugh with tales of courtship and early marriage. And when the last guest had finally left and it was just the two of them again, they sat together on their porch, in the same spot where they had spent countless evenings over the past 3 decades. "A perfect day," Victoria declared. "A perfect life," Vince corrected. Victoria could not argue with that. It had not been a perfect life in the sense of being without difficulty or challenge. They had faced hardships, losses, struggles. But it had been perfect in the ways that mattered, filled with love, partnership, purpose, and joy. The years that followed were gentler, slower. Victoria and Vince were in their 60s now, content to let the younger generation take over most of the day-to-day responsibilities of running businesses and managing the ranch. They spent their time with their grandchildren, who adored their grandfather's stories of his cowboy adventures and their grandmother's quiet wisdom. In 1918, 40 years after that fateful day in the street, Vince and Victoria sat together on their porch as they had so many times before. Vince's hair was white now and Victoria's had gone silver, but the love in their eyes when they looked at each other had not dimmed. 40 years, Vince marveled. "It has gone by so fast. And yet it feels like I have known you forever," Victoria said. "I can barely remember what life was like before you." "Harder," Vince said simply. "Life before you was harder, lonelier, less meaningful. You gave me everything, Victoria." "We gave each other everything," Victoria corrected gently. "That is what makes it work." As the sun set on another day, Victoria reflected on the miracle of their life together. A chance encounter in the street had led to this, a love that had lasted 4 decades and counting, a family that spread across multiple generations, a legacy of kindness and community that would outlive them both. She had been mocked in the street, but a cowboy had said, "Walk with me" instead, and in doing so, he had changed the course of both their lives. From that single act of kindness and courage had flowed everything else: the marriage, the family, the businesses, the community, the love. As they headed inside for the evening, Vince held the door for Victoria, just as he had thousands of times before. She smiled up at him, her heart still fluttering slightly the way it had when she was 24 and falling in love for the first time. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For everything. For defending me that day. For seeing me when no one else did. For choosing to walk with me. For every day of these 40 years. Vince pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "Thank you for letting me. Thank you for taking a chance on a dusty cowboy who had nothing to offer but his love. Thank you for building this life with me." They stood there in the doorway, holding each other as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who had found each other against the odds and built something beautiful together. A love story that had started with mockery in a street and an offer to walk together instead, and had blossomed into something rare and precious. As the years continued to pass, that love only deepened. They grew old together, their bodies slowing but their hearts still beating in sync. When Vince's health began to fail in his 72nd year, Victoria nursed him with the same devotion he had always shown her. And when Victoria struggled with her own health challenges, Vince was there, holding her hand, reminding her she was not alone. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. It was a smaller celebration than the 35th, as they were both too tired for large parties, but it was no less meaningful. 5 decades of marriage, of partnership, of love. 50 years, Victoria said that evening as they sat together, just the two of them once more. I never imagined when I was young that I would be this blessed. Neither did I, Vince admitted. His voice was weaker now, his breathing sometimes labored, but his eyes were still the same striking blue that had caught her attention so many years ago. But I would do it all again, every moment, just to end up here with you. As would I, Victoria said, her own voice trembling with emotion. You were my miracle, Vince, my blessing, the answer to prayers I did not even know how to pray. They spent their final years together in the peace and comfort they had earned, surrounded by the family they had created and the community they had served. When Vince passed peacefully in his sleep in 1930 at the age of 79, Victoria grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given more than 50 years together, years filled with love and purpose and joy. Victoria lived for 3 more years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, about the life they had built together, about the importance of kindness and courage and choosing love every day. When she passed in 1933 at the age of 79, surrounded by her family, her last words were a whisper, "Walk with me." Those who heard it understood. She was calling to Vince, knowing that wherever he was, he would be waiting to offer his arm once more, to walk beside her into whatever came next, just as he had walked beside her through every day of their earthly life together. Victoria and Vince Garrett were buried side by side in the Provo cemetery, their headstones simple but marked with a single phrase that captured the essence of their love story. They chose to walk together, and in doing so, found everything that matters. The boarding houses that Victoria had built continued to operate for decades, eventually becoming historic landmarks in Provo. The ranch that Vince had helped build into one of the most successful in Utah remained in the family for generations. But more than the businesses or the property, what Victoria and Vince left behind was a legacy of love, kindness, and partnership. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren told their story over and over, how a cowboy had seen a woman being mocked in the street and had offered her his arm instead. How that single act of courage and kindness had led to a love story that lasted more than 5 decades. How 2 people who should have been strangers had instead become partners, building a life of meaning and beauty together. And in the telling and retelling of their story, Victoria and Vince's legacy lived on, inspiring new generations to choose kindness over cruelty, courage over comfort, and love over fear. To see people who are being marginalized and to step forward and say, as Vince had said so long ago, "Walk with me instead." Because sometimes, the simplest acts of kindness can change everything. Sometimes, offering your arm to someone who is struggling can be the beginning of something miraculous. And sometimes, choosing to walk together through life's challenges and joys is the greatest love story of all. Victoria and Vince had proven that, and their love story, which began on a dusty street in Provo, Utah Territory in 1878, became a legend that inspired and guided their descendants for generations to come. A testament to the transformative power of choosing love, compassion, and partnership in a world that often offers mockery, isolation, and cruelty instead. Their story, in the end, was simple. A cowboy saw a woman being mocked in the street and said, "Walk with me instead." And from that choice flowed a lifetime of love, a family that spanned generations, and a legacy that proved that one person's courage and kindness can change not just one life, but many.